I'm Damon Pfister, an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Lisa Karanen was planning the 2012 ARST pre-conference and came to the recognition that it was the 20-year anniversary of the founding of ARST in 1992. And so she called me one day and said, hey, I'm kind of wanting to document some of the early founders of ARST, their memories of the conference, and sort of create an oral history of the kind of intellectual history of the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. And so she asked whether or not I would be interested in spearheading this project. And immediately, of course, I was interested in it because I'm a sucker and cannot say no, especially to people like Lisa. But I obviously intuited as well that it was an incredible opportunity to not only meet and talk with and interview some of the people that I've been reading for the better part of a decade, but also to contribute to kind of a documentation of the history of a subfield that is important to me. And so, of course, I said yes. Now, Lisa's original vision was that I might go around and interview people with an iPhone, get some good audio, 5 or 10 minutes of kind of, their favorite ARST memory. And again, because I'm a bit of a sucker, I thought, well, Lisa, what if we thought bigger? What if we thought about making, kind of a documentary out of all of this oral history material? And what if we did video? Well, one thing led to another, and we ended up having a basically professional grade studio set up in a hotel room in the conference hotel, where we conducted interviews with 12 or 15 of the major movers and shakers in ARST's founding, but also some of the most significant rhetoricians of science, technology, and medicine working in the field today who were able to come to the pre-conference. It's nothing like a comprehensive history of ARST, I think. There's so many people, many of whom the interviewees sort of noted, whose presence were missing. And so, like any oral history, I think it's incredibly partial. But it does, I think, provide a better glimpse of the history of the organization and the intellectual history of the rhetoric of science, which, as one of the themes in the pre-conference noted, might well be the future of rhetorical studies as science and technology controversies become more and more central, and as all controversies sort of get absorbed into science and technical controversies. So one reason why I think it's really important to do an oral history of the Association for the Rhetoric of Science and Technology at this moment is to preserve, moments, is to preserve the climate and the conditions that drew people into the field in the first place, when it was just a glimmer in a couple of scholars at Iowa and Pitt's eye. And there's been an increasing interest in the history of the field. So I think of Bill Keith's book and Pat Gerke's book about kind of the early years of the speech communication discipline. And I think that to pair that kind of turn to the early history of NCA, we need to start thinking about more recent histories as well. And maybe 20 years isn't a super recent history, but it seems to me like Keith and Gerke are working from a real patchwork of documents, and we are lucky enough to have living texts here in the form of the founders of the field and the founders of ARST. And that is a resource that we simply must, I hate to say take advantage of, but that is, I think, the best way to say it. And fortunately, they're happy to be taken advantage of and share their insight. And one thing that really struck me, these are obviously incredibly smart people, incredibly erudite people. They're also incredibly eloquent people. I've always been a big fan of the line from Kenneth Burke that is something along the lines of, you can tell an artist by the preoccupation that they pay to an object, right? So the photographer who tries to produce a truly stunning image of a landscape or a flower pays attention to how the light is hitting it, to the dew and the mist and the snow and whatever else. And by training your eye to see in a particular way, you can produce something that is beautiful. Well, all the people that we interviewed are artists in their own right. They have been preoccupied with the subject of science and its rhetorics for so long that they have this incredible store of examples and figures, and are able to weave things together in a way that is somewhat daunting, actually. To think about these are role models for us, and they have set the bar so incredibly high. I hope that in 30 or 40 years that I can capture a glimmer of their eloquence if I'm ever asked to do something like this. And that's something that I think is that you get with the living text, that you get with oral interviews, that doesn't necessarily translate to the page. They're all incredible writers and beautiful to read and so on, but getting a bit of dialectic going and getting them in a slightly less formal idiom, but to see the eloquence and the brilliance of their insights in that modality as well was a real special part of this project. So it's been a real pleasure to do it. I have been fortunate to work with a couple of great graduate students throughout the whole process. One of the interesting things about ARST for me is that in some ways it's for the graduate students, and it has been run by the graduate students. The reason we have ARST right now is that there was a period of years, I gather, where grad students really kind of took over the program, and there's a new generation of graduate students that are drawn to rhetoric of science that are really stupendous. So the two graduate students who volunteered to give up much of their NCA to watch interviews are Jennifer Malkowski from UC Boulder and Kenny Walker from the University of Arizona. And they really did yeoman's work in taking notes and doing some interviews and getting people into the right place, and just helping me think through some of the questions early on, and doing a lot of the prep work in terms of how are we going to conceptualize this thing, and what are the questions that we want to ask. And so that's it's been great to work with the future of ARST. And it's a little odd too, because I'm young enough still to think of myself as part of the future of ARST, but to work with people who were in the position that I was in 3 or 4 or 5 years ago has been really fun. And I think that, if I may be so bold, I think that the 20th Bicentennial is kind of a turning point for ARST. There's a kind of institutional legitimacy that they've gained now, and they've got a rich history of scholarship and figures in the field. And the top figures in the rhetoric of science are the top figures in rhetorical studies generally. And so I'm interested to see what the next 20 years will bring.
So one question I have for you, Damon, is how does this oral history project, as a kind of service to ARST, link to your own research and your own interest in online digital technologies and the rhetoric of science?
That is, of course, a good question, because as I thought about, and it's a cautionary tale because it's a lot of work. There are a number of hours put into this by everyone, by Lisa and by Kenny and Jen and myself, and frankly, you have to be really careful about saying yes to things. And so I actually talked to my chair and a couple of colleagues about whether or not this was a good idea for me, whether or not this was a good investment of my time. A couple of things made me say yes. First of all, I think even if this was probably a bad trade-off, just the chance to talk with these people, and frankly to get some FaceTime, with top scholars is like unparalleled, and I don't know that I will ever have an opportunity to do this again, unless this is so successful that other units in NCA hire the three of us to do oral histories for themselves, which is just crazy enough that it might happen,
Side job.
Part of the reason that I said yes is that this actually counts towards my tenure and promotion file, and that's not automatic, but the University of Nebraska has been extremely forward-thinking in terms of trying to embrace new digital modes of scholarship. So, I mean, the level of, to kind of reduce things here, the level of raw data that we have gathered over 12 or 14 hours of interviews is phenomenal. And it's now a resource for other people to draw upon. And I think there's a lot to mine from these interviews. And so, you know, in the same way that like creating a data set or creating a body of, you know, a survey or a body of interviews and that you can draw upon and make available to other scholars, you know, or focus group data. I mean, like, it serves the same kind of purpose. So more specifically for my own interests in terms of like, what does this mean for networked media? Well, the funny thing is that you know, in talking with folks over the course of the last 2 days, they keep on hitting upon themes that I'm hitting upon. And so it's fascinating. Just two brief examples. Carolyn Miller was working on a project with her graduate student about how the internet is eroding boundaries between the public and private and technical, really between the public and technical spheres. And that's exactly an argument that I make in my book manuscript, in my book project, and about the science blog Real Climate. That science blog was at the heart of the ClimateGate controversy, which Lawrence Prelli talked about. And Prelli was talking about sort of the rhetorics of display and what was at stake with the legitimacy of the hockey stick and the kind of, you know, power that visual image had in controversies over climate science. And I'm going to cite both of those interviews in a revision of that chapter now. You know, so I mean, it's amazing to me just to be able to sort of listen reflectively to people, you know, talk about things, and you realize that they've thought about these things so deeply, but are coming at them from different angles that the utility for my own work is really extraordinary. I will say also that I just, you know, bluntly pushed my own agenda. I asked a question like, well, what does the internet mean for rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine? How might rhetoricians of science, technology, and medicine take advantage of the opportunity that I think the internet is presenting to sort of reconsider or revise some of our received communication theories? I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think that, you know, it's a new medium. Jeannie Fonestock was talking about how the practices of science are radically changing because of the internet. And it seems obvious to me then that so are the rhetorics of science, and we ought to take account of that somehow. We got some really interesting answers on that. At the same time, I think that it showed how much work needs to be done in that particular area, because I don't think that we have a very good sense of what research might be done around this. Like, what impact is the internet having on rhetorics of science, and how might people involved with ARST research them? So, yeah, I mean, we had some really stimulating responses, but no one had a particularly clear research agenda. No one said, you know, someone needs to do a study on this. I mean, Carolyn Miller is working on something related to it, but I think that's one growth area that I see. I realize how easy it is to just kind of go on. Yeah. You know, and part of it is because you can't see your nonverbals.
Oh, really?
So like.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, like you can, yeah, you can just barely. But I think probably. Well, this is an interesting point. Like it's an oral history, right? So they're not closed questions, but I intentionally tried to not give any reactions or verbal response so that our audio track was clean.
Yeah.
But as a result, and I mean, these are talkers, right? I mean, they're rhetoricians of science. As a result, we had some extremely long answers, brilliantly long answers. I mean, we easily could have had an hour and a half with some of these folks, and they would have gladly sat for it. but it's part of a dynamic here that I think was very conducive to the extended response. And of course, I mean, getting all of that on record is just amazing from my vantage point.
It's amazing to hear you talk about the changing practices of tenure, that things like oral history projects are becoming more credentialed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I hear, you know, some, as a grad student, you're always kind of told what's a little bit of a double standard, which is say yes more than you say no, but be careful about saying yes too much, especially to say the work that hasn't in the past been counted as much for,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a publication, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to be, you know, the high standard. But it's changing, and you, in your position as an assistant professor now, are helped by going to talk to your higher administrators, are changing. You're changing that practice by doing this kind of thing. That's making space for a different kind of scholarship.
Well, I won't claim much agency in that. I mean, it's kind of happening around me. I think. I mean, I think that part of the realization that people are having is the norms of print are fading, and it seems ridiculous to me to think that we will have print journals in 10 years. No, we're always going to have journal articles. I mean, there's something incredibly powerful about the depth and specificity of a journal article. That'll migrate online, of course. But I think that the norms of print privilege the journal article, and now that those are no longer really as dominant as they used to be, we're getting some opening up of the kinds of academic expressiveness and what counts as academic scholarship, and I think that's really fortunate. There's a wide range of ways to make a scholarly argument, and to assume that a 20-page linear research argument or research article is the only way or is the best way, I think is it's off base. And it's also, I mean, the beautiful thing about this, and one of the things that I'm really interested in my scholarship, is how are we making things available for others, right? I mean, this is part of the ethos of the digital humanities movement, which is, let's make tools, let's create data sets, let's create things that can then be manipulated by other people. And scholars have always manipulated journal articles, right? That's what citation is essentially. But this can be, the Oral History Project can be remixed in 100 different ways. And part of our hope, I think, is that some graduate seminar in the future picks up the vision of short-form documentaries where we take particular themes from the documentaries, say the role of invention in the rhetoric of science, or figuration, or advice to future scholars, or the role of the internet, and make short documentaries that can then be stitched together and viewed together to make a single kind of longer documentary that tells not just the organizational history of ARST, but also the intellectual history of the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine.
You know what else strikes me is how this project links to some of the themes that we heard in the pre-conference. So we talked a lot in the pre-conference about going public and what it means for rhetoricians to go public, to engage with the historians, the sociologists, the philosophers, and the public at large. And the risks that are associated with that, but also some of the rewards. And so I'm wondering how you see this project linked to that. And then secondly, and the second thing we heard in the pre-conference that relates to this project, it seems to me, is we need projects about the rhetoric of science, right? So not just let's rhetoricize science, or let's build rhetorical theory from science, but let's look at ourselves in kind of like a meta awareness, right? So can you talk about those two things as they relate to the scholarship,
right,
some of the new areas that came out of the pre-conference?
Well, one of the most persistent challenges for ARST, and I think for rhetoric of science more broadly, is the visibility challenge. There's, people are now making fun of the kind of woe is us theme that, and that doesn't really seem to have much traction anymore. I think that what we saw today was a shift from what are we, what do we want to be, what are we doing, to we are obviously important and we now have institutional authority. How do we expand that? And how do we bring more people into the fold? In terms of this project, I think it could be crucial for enhancing the visibility of rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. Not only do we have now oral histories that will circulate, they'll be posted online and linked from the ARST website. So, people that are in history and philosophy of science programs, perhaps not the professors, but the graduate students, when they're searching YouTube, are going to run across these things. And there'd be even more utility if there were these short form documentaries that were thematically organized, such that people could say, what does rhetoric add to science? I've heard about the rhetoric of science thing. Boom, here's 10 minutes with the smartest people in the field, the people who founded the field, talking about what rhetoric adds to science and how science as a context or a domain of study can contribute to the building of rhetorical theory. And that, I think, is pretty powerful. And I'd wager that there's nothing analogous for the history and philosophy of science, or STS there. And I could be wrong, but I think that might help, some visibility issues. The kind of reflective turn then, or reflexive turn to studying rhetoric of science itself, it's another interesting question, and y'all are welcome to come join me up here if you want to meditate on this. But I've been thinking about this quite a bit, actually, in the context of some other work that I'm doing. It's meta rhetoric, right? It's rhetoric about rhetoric, and it's the study of rhetorics of rhetoric, or it's the study of the rhetoric of rhetorics. I'm not quite sure where the plural should go, but this, I think, really aids that project, right? So to sort of think like, what are the tropes that we invoke in the rhetoric of science? Now, a fascinating one to me that becomes apparent during our interviews with like Wilson and James Wynn in particular, the upstream downstream metaphor, right? So there is a trope that seems to me kind of underanalyzed in the rhetoric of science, like. It flows and it still kind of replicates that assumption that information flows in one way from the scientists, from the experts, to the public, to citizens. With all of this work on citizen science now, we're seeing the flow reverse. And I think one of the points that were made by a couple of the interviewees are that there's much more interpenetration between the public face of rhetoric of science, or public rhetorics of science, and epistemic rhetorics of science. And I wonder, that it seems to me like that metaphor creates kind of a blind spot to realize how deeply imbricated these two modes of rhetoric are. So I don't know, maybe a meta-rhetoric of science it would be an interesting project. And there's one place where I think you might get some traction, and if we could articulate a different metaphor for the interaction between the epistemic and the public faces of rhetoric of science, then that could be extremely productive. I'm not sure what that alternative metaphor would look like, if it was like a zipper or, but I don't know how far you can push and pull that. But it seems to me like that these things are just becoming increasingly more interpenetrated. And that's some of the stuff that I research, right? Like on climate science blogs, you have the top people in climate science lurking in comments, answering citizens' questions. And their questions and their answers are being shaped by citizens' responses, right? So it's not this kind of didactic, pedagogical role of experts where I'm coming in to teach you, I'm going to set you straight, you're going to go off into the world as a good little scientist. It is much more participatory and kind of a co-construction of expertise. And I think that kind of, that's a different way of thinking about the relationship between public rhetorics and epistemic rhetorics, one that upstream, downstream seems to conceal a bit. But that's one approach to a meta-rhetoric of science, and still working out the details. I'd love to hear other thoughts on, what else would you look at? I don't know.
I'm Jen Malkowski, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder.
And I'm Kenny Walker. I'm a graduate student at the University of Arizona in Tucson.
So you all volunteered for this project. Why?
Well, I've been told as a grad student to say yes more than no, and that has tended to serve me fairly well. So that's one of the reasons, is I like to say yes to all kinds of weird, wacky projects involved with the rhetoric of science. But mostly because I saw this as a very kairotic moment for ARST. And as a young scholar coming into the field, the opportunity to have some personal time with maybe 24 of the best scholars in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine is an unparalleled opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's a huge opportunity. Now I can put faces to all the names on my comprehensive exam list. So it is a way to personalize what I'm reading.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can underestimate how much energy that gives young scholars to pursue their own ideas, to feel like it's a real conversation rather than just reading books now.
Yeah, I would agree with that last part, and I'm quite honestly jealous that Kenny got this experience before his comps. Because in particular, listening to Celeste Condit talk about her work, I'm ready to read her book again, and I know it's going to be a completely different read and an inspirational read in ways that I didn't connect with the text when I was by myself, and it was on a list of many books that I was trying to absorb. And so having this personal connection, and that's what I hope that this project really provides for a lot of future rhetoricians of science, technology, and medicine, is that personalized element. And in terms of themes, speaking in terms of themes, that close-knit community sort of aspect of ARSTom, or ARMSTom, or whatever it's going to end up being, is a really, when you talk about kairotic moments, I feel lucky, my mom would say blessed, to experience ARST in this moment of growth and opportunity when it's still quite communal, and I hope to be able to preserve that even as we do grow.
So there's that kind of hope, I think, that we're both expressing from that,
Yeah.
and the hope for growth, but also a ton of work to do. I mean, it's incredible that because we're small, that has opportunities and constraints. And so what I am really hopeful about are those constraints too, and how we might push against them and really participate in building ARST. Because it's worth building, and I think one thing I'm really taking away is the value of the ideas that have existed now for 20-some years, maybe even longer. So it's worth continuing and worth putting a lot of energy into.
And that reminds me also of something else that I know that we've discussed throughout the process, was kind of how the Association for Rhetoric of Science and Technology has been, it's definitely been a part of this community, but how it's been kind of this organic structure in the background, loosely holding things together. And from one angle, we discussed that as maybe we'd like to see more of kind of the prominence that this association played for these folks. But what I've taken away from these last couple of days is that it's the quality of the ideas that keep this community together. And the fact that, when we talk about invention, that you can see the dialogue and the conversation that's to be had in the context that ARST, yes, loosely pulls together. It has an inventive property that carries the field forward, and I think that we're lucky in the sense that the rest of the public is starting to recognize the centrality of science, technology, and medical studies. So.
And to that point, what I was struck by in the number of scholars when they were talking about their own backgrounds and how they came into rhetoric of science, I shared so many of those experiences, those narratives of I was interested in science, always had an interest in science, and then this or that happened, and I ran into this person, or I read this text, or I came across that idea, and that led me into this realm called rhetoric. And I think it's small now because it takes a certain kind of structure, maybe even a social structure, to have these kinds of people come together and be the weird people that we are. But I'm seeing more and more of them, not just here at ARST, but we've been talking a lot about how many self-identified rhetoricians of science, technology, math, and medicine there are. And it's really encouraging to see just how many people are getting interested in it.
Right. And I think that path, that sort of happenstance, serendipitous path, or mine was probably a lot more clunky. But yeah, I think that what that reflects, and I think that the testament in these videos to that process will back me up here, is that something that all of these scholars hold in common is this genuine stance of openness to what might come. And I think that in the face of science, technology, medicine, that can be unsettling for a lot of folks that are encountering these industries or these tough questions. But I saw in folks' eyes or laughs, at the camera, that these moments of, oh my gosh, I got that, or that's very interesting, was an exciting, mobilizing force that I think everybody shared. And I would say that that stance of openness to ideas and possibility is something that this association in particular, I think, lends to kind of the troubling realities that are science and technology and medicine in a lot of ways. So.
It's something that, just really quick, it's something that James Wynn said too when he was talking about your advice to grad students, which is like, jump in, take a risk. That's okay. Manage the uncertainty that is being a grad student in rhetoric of science, technology, engineering, and math, and medicine. That's a good thing. It's paid off for these scholars, and to hear those success stories is incredibly inspiring.
One of the things that struck me was that these are largely senior scholars, some of the best scholars in the rhetoric and rhetorical studies generally, and they're doing their best work now. I think if you ask them, what's your best work, and we asked them, like, what's your biggest contribution? A lot of them said, it's like the, my central book, the book that, 10 years ago or whatever. What kind of inspiration does that give you for your thinking about your own career? Because some of these people are, 50, 60, 70 years old. John Campbell looks like he's, 40, but is not. But yet he's still doing incredible work.
It's on camera.
That's okay. I don't think he'd mind. If I had the spirit and energy of him at my age, I would consider myself blessed. But what kind of inspiration does that give you?
Well, okay. So the book part is a little intimidating because I'm about to launch into my dissertation prospectus writing / defending. And so to note the impact that those dissertation projects have in the course of a career was both exciting and energizing, but also humbling in terms of the immediate task before me. But I think there is a certain element of patience that I recognized as part of greatness, I guess. I know greatness sounds maybe some cheesy, but that's really honest. When you hear Dr. Campbell talking about his work and reflecting on some of his more recent interests or ideas, really kind of bearing the fruits of a long, long labor, that it's, once again, humbling, a little intimidating, but it highlights this element of patience that I think, as a scholar, we're both lucky to have the opportunity to explore something in depth for that long. And I think that sort of experience is fleeting experience in this kind of saturated environment that we live in. And so, that's kind of a takeaway that I hope to hang on to. It was both humbling and, again,
you have to be humble to be an academic. And to really succeed. Because this is such a long-term strategy to decide to become an academic. And if you are overeager, or if you want to make money really quickly, or if those are some of your priorities, or at all, if you want to make any money, if money is on top 10 list, you might not want to become an academic. But if it's 11, then you know, you might there's just it's just a different way of life. You know, you choose a way of life, and it's not. I've had a job. I've had lots of jobs. I've had good jobs. I've had jobs in the sciences, and I don't want a job like that necessarily. I want an intellectual life, and that is. So what strikes me is when I see some of these scholars who are retiring, or have retired, and yes, they're still producing their best work. That is incredibly inspiring because I know I'm in it for that long, or I hope to be in it for that long. And so that actually takes some of the pressure off me now. I feel like I don't have to produce my very best thing right now. That I've got hopefully 30, 40 years to really think through all these ideas, let them really saturate. So when, you know, I reach that sort of intellectual peak, then you might produce, you know, something that's always better than what had come before. That long-term scope, I think, is essential to be a successful academic. And then in the short term, you just have to work your ass off like 24/7. So it's that weird kind of paradox of
Hurry up, but slow down.
hurry up, but think really broadly and think long term about not what only you can do for yourself, but for others and for the discipline. That's a kind of takeaway from all these incredible scholars that we've been listening to.
So we have inquisitiveness, patience, and stamina, 3 traits that you just talked about in turn, that you sort of gathered from successful scholars here. Any other trait that you see kind of across the interviews that stands out at you?
It helps to have a photographic memory. Like I listened to Jeannie Fanistock, and I think I was telling you this, Damon. She talks like she writes. She has this incredible ability to theorize and then give example. And the seamlessness of her ability to theorize and provide really specific case studies, I think, is a hallmark of her written work. But I was just struck at the suppleness of her mind to be able to do that and to weave in and out of the epistemic parts of science and into the rhetorical theory and then back in and back out. That, I really admire that. And I saw a number of sort of intellectual habits in some of these scholars, in all of these scholars, that I am really I just hope I absorbed, and I hope I can try to imitate.
And I would say that another quality would be generosity, being generous with your time for up-and-coming scholars. I just know, I mean, even taking the time to do this interview, it's 45 minutes out of a busy, crammed schedule. But a lot of them noted, I know, in advice for future, you could see this offer of an opportunity to mentor others. And so I think being generous with your time, when you see a bright mind or an interested mind or an inquisitive mind, one of these 6 qualities, if you see that in anybody, to spend some time with that. If time is asked of you, kind of say yes more than no.
Yeah.
And then also being generous with your, and this is kind of goes back to the openness thing too, that be generous with your ability to see the world from different perspectives, always, you know. Even when something rubs you the wrong way, to still kind of give it another chance and spend time with it is, I think, another quality that I saw, you know, here. And